Everyone has their favorite coasters, and everyone knows the ones that tend to be avoided. Now what gets really interesting is digging into what people consider to be overrated or an underrated pick. Even more so, there's some that are overhated or underhated, and there's some that are weighted correctly but deserve a little bit more attention and hype. Now I asked Instagram for some suggestions, so here are my opinions on some random roller coasters I've ridden. Starting off with a coaster that had some of the biggest hype in recent memory, we have the Island of Adventures coaster, Velocicoaster. Now, I got to ride multiple times in January of this year, and I think the hype is real. I personally have it in my top 2, and it does everything you want from a ride. Now, I'm gonna say it's pretty neutrally rated, but I'm gonna say, maybe just be a twinge overrated. There was some pretty crazy hype that came out, especially before anyone got to ride. Now, moving to Kings Island, we have the world's longest B&M invert, Banshee. Going into this ride, the reputation was it had a brutal rattle throughout, and the vest restraints kind of hurt the experience a bit. Now, I'm going to have to say that this ride is pretty underrated and just a tad overhated. It's my favorite invert in front of half of the train, but in that back row, it almost knocked me out the day I ridden it. Now, the rattle's bad, and while the vest can be a bit restrictive, I think the removal of any chance of headbanging is well worth the change in restraint. I think it really deserves, we talked about in the top tier of inverts, just kind of make sure you ride in the front, and then they get rid of the problem. Now, staying in Ohio, we have Steel Vengeance, my personal #1 coaster. Now, I had the luxury of riding this blind, and it absolutely blew my mind before I was truly an enthusiast. Now, that was 4 years ago. I still hold this as the best coaster I've ridden, but the notion that it will never be topped has kind of been thrown around since it opened, but it's kind of faded with rides like Zadra and Gwazi now open. Now, I think, if anything, it may be a little overhated at this point because people just tend to be different and they want to say it's not that good, but it's really incredible. It's pretty properly rated as one of the top 3 coasters in the world, and it's a little overhyped, but that's kind of faded now. Back in Orlando at Universal, we have Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket, and this ride has all hate, all love, different feelings from pretty much everyone I talk to. Now, I'm going to look at this one in a little more of a unique way from my younger eyes when I first got to ride it a few years back, and I really loved the ride. I thought it was great. Now, going back this year, I really overhyped it for myself pretty bad, and I think, if anything, the hate's pretty well deserved that it gets. The track is really far from smooth at this point, and the ride itself doesn't really do anything. I mean, take away the albeit great music function, and the coaster's kind of just average, if not below. Next, at Six Flags America, you'll find WildOne, a relocated wooden coaster that's one of the oldest still in operation. Now, going to this park, I didn't hear anything about this ride, and I really expected the worst because of the age. I thought, oh, maybe it's 100+ years and it's rough and it's just around because it's Six Flags America. But I think most agree that I've ridden it. It's a pretty solid woody with some fun airtime moments, but I think it just needs a little more hype. I love this as an easy pick for the park's #3 coaster. Now, finishing up the Kings Island coasters, we have the newest and tallest coaster, Orion. Now, this is pretty easy for me. It isn't my favorite in the park, and it's my least favorite Giga, but the hate this thing gets is just absurd. Ride it for what it is, which is a floater-filled, butter-smooth speed machine, and it's a blast. Sure, could have used about 500 feet more of track, yeah, but it's so easy to marathon, so just enjoy it. Then down at the sister park, we have Grizzly. Now, at Kings Dominion, this ride has its fans and its defenders, but I'm sorry, my ride on 2019 was one of my least favorite coaster rides on any wooden coaster I've experienced. Outside of Wildcat at Lake Compounds, this may be my most unenjoyable wooden coaster. Now, it's rough, it doesn't really have any fun moments to offset anything, just tear it out and give the park something better. Next up, we have Titan, one of the Juvenola hypers at Six Flags Over Texas. Now, this is a monster that enthusiasts love to direct hate at for its layout. It has a terrible drop angle and no airtime, I'll give it that. But that being said, the speed and intensity lead it to being a pretty fun ride. Now, for perspective, the drop angle of 65 degrees is only 7 less than the beloved Superman at Six Flags New England, so it's really not that bad. Now, I'm going to say it's underrated, overhated, and it should just be known as a decent ride. Now we have more of a model than a single coaster. The Spaghetti Bowl Premier Launch coasters can be found at Kings Dominion, Kings Island, and multiple Six Flags parks. While the outdoor versions give a faster ride experience with no mid-course, the indoor with the space theming of Flight of Fear is equally as awesome. Now, besides the bad restraints, these should really be seen as very strong supporting coasters, but instead they kind of tend to be ignored and not talked about. Now, I don't really see any hate on these, but I think they're underrated and underhyped. Name another model with a really strong launch, inversions, and tons of near misses with inside and well themed, it's a bit rare. But staying on the 90s premier launch coasters, we have the Mr. Freeze clones. Now these are intense as hell, and the back spike offers one of the better coaster moments around. However, I hold these kind of in the same level as the Spaghetti Bowl coasters. They are really strong supporting rides, but many hold them to say that they're probably better than New Texas Giant at Over Texas, and that just isn't true. I think these are a little bit overrated and definitely overhyped. It's a shuttle coaster with a short layout. It's just not that great. They're a little rough too. Returning back to Orlando for the final time, we have Mako at SeaWorld Orlando. Crowned by many as the best B&M hyper in the business, I agree in my limited experience. Now, it's my favorite B&M and my favorite hyper, but it isn't by that much of a wide margin. I think the airtime is a small, tiny bit overrated because it's not the best B&M hyper airtime. That belongs to Diamondback. But overall, the community seems to agree that this is pretty properly rated and it's an amazing ride. Then we have Comet at HersheyPark, which is a fun classic Woody that flew under the radar for years. Recently, it's ridden up and really gained quite the following and support for being probably the best Woody at the park. Now, I've never really loved this coaster. It typically has a really long line that I don't find worth it, but it's a good ride, just not great. I'll have to say, as of recently, it's kind of become overhyped, but maybe some re-rides will change my mind this year. For another King's Dominion ride, we have Dominator. The world's longest floorless coaster is, well, it's a classic floorless coaster. My biggest issue here is the ride only has 5 inversions, while shorter rides of the same model typically have 6 or 7. Now the ride feels like it's missing a couple elements, and the slight rattle make it that not much more than a slightly above average floorless for me. Many call this the best of the bunch, but it's a little bit overrated in the floorless model itself, but I'll say it's underhyped because the model as a whole deserves more respect. For the last B&M, we have Raptor at Cedar Point. Once again, I don't have too many rides on Raptor, but I remember it being just fine. It didn't really set itself apart from the average invert for me, and I just found it very forgettable. Meanwhile, I find this constantly pushed into the upper tier of inverts with Montu, but I think it barely tops the Batman clones. It's a bit overrated, and that's about it. Finally, we're back to my home park in Six Flags Great Adventure, and the consensus best ride there, El Toro. Honestly, I probably underrate this ride just a little bit because I've ridden it so much. Now, I've seen it at its worst and its best days and seasons. Now, that being said, it's my favorite Woody and probably has 4 of the best airtime moments around. Now, I would say overall, it may be a tad overrated because many consider this the best Woody, no questions asked, but I think there's a conversation for a lot of other really good ones. But the people who call this short by length, I think that's kind of overhating. I think the pacing's just so good, it makes it a little bit of a shorter ride. Now that's going to wrap up this week's video, and if you want to participate in picking some more rides for future videos, make sure to check out my Instagram page. You can also comment below. I love hearing your opinions and starting conversations about this stuff. But till next week, that's all from the shores of Island Coasters.